Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Up for Growth 2021 Virtual Summit for Housing Changemakers. My name is Salim Furth, and this session is Big Ideas That Can Win. Before I introduce you to our panelists, I'd like to give you a brief overview of Up for Growth, an organization that I am deeply engaged with because it works to create a world where housing is always an opportunity and never an obstacle. Up for Growth is a national cross-sector member network committed to solving the housing shortage and affordability crisis through data-driven research and evidence-based policy. They provide timely research and insights on housing policy at the local, state, and federal levels to their members, along with networking opportunities at events like these. Membership is open to organizations of all sizes, and if you'd like to learn more, you can navigate to the link shown at the bottom of this slide. I encourage you to do so. I'm going to take down the slides now and introduce this session and our panelists. So earlier today, Washington's Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck shared his 7 principles of housing reform. Along with earlier sessions, he's helped to frame the motivation for zoning reform. And then after the Lieutenant Governor, we heard from 3 other legislators who had a great discussion of the political barriers and bipartisan opportunities for housing reform in their states. And here, I really want to get into the weeds of policy ideas. And I've got 2 motivations for this. So one is just, we've got the motivation, we've talked about the politics. Okay, now what is it we really want to do with that motivation and those possibilities? And the other is a survey that I ran recently where I emailed about 100 YIMBYs and YIMBY allies, not policymakers, but scholars and activists who I know. And I asked them to rate a list of about 20 policies that I was putting together for an issue brief. I asked them to rate each of those on a scale of 1 to 10 on which ones are politically difficult or easy, and which ones are more impactful or less impactful, right? So it's fine to have a small bore policy that's easy to pass, but you don't want to spend a lot of energy on a policy that doesn't do much. And what I really got out of the survey was that we don't agree. Not that we don't agree on the desirability, but we as a movement, as scholars, people who spend their full-time days working on this, we don't actually know up front which policies are going to really move the needle on affordability, housing supply, opportunity. And I think that conversations like the one we're going to have now, with diverse perspectives from people who have really done their homework and care and are willing to think big, these are going to be crucial conversations for identifying the policies that will be big wins in 2022 and beyond. So with that, without further ado, I'm joined today by 3 legislators who really care and have introduced ambitious legislation in their own states. Senator Stanley Chang from Hawaii, Senator Chuck Edwards from North Carolina, and Representative Nicole Macri from Washington State. Representative Macri, I'm going to start with you. You introduced a pair of bills last year that would have limited rent increases and allowed more types of housing in much of your state. Tell us about those and tell us why that would have been a big win. It didn't pass last year. And where are you going to go with those ideas or similar ones, having had that experience in 2020?
Thanks, Salim, and thanks for having me here today. Looks like a really great group with us this afternoon. Back in 2020, before COVID, I introduced this pair of bills, which, there are many policy concepts that can be quite controversial in the housing policy space, but maybe I picked the 2 winners in state preemption of local zoning authority and really digging in on a statewide kind of rental and rental housing fee regulation strategy. I did it deliberately to provoke conversation both with my colleagues in the legislature as well as with the many stakeholders who have an interest in moving forward on housing policy that ensures broad access to housing, closes opportunities for housing discrimination, and creates diversity in our housing across the state. And we made good progress in the conversation on those bills. It certainly gets the attention of cities, of both private and public developers, and tenant activists, et cetera, to put out policies like that. And these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have about what are our concerns, what are our fears, and what do we really see as the opportunities for addressing both affordability, but also addressing housing discrimination and creating, working towards a vision of real housing abundance. And so we learned quite a lot from those policies. We learned the pressure points. We got to engage in good conversation with our local community leaders, our elected leaders, and their association about it. And we got to talk more about what are the right anti-displacement policies. So there is this tension that exists between these supply side strategies and strategies that are aimed to protect communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the high cost of housing. And by introducing these bills together, really taking a cue from the approach Oregon took, my goal was to see, are these policy approaches applicable in different contexts in different states? Can we really scale up this approach to building both more housing supply while simultaneously protecting folks who are most vulnerable to our current housing conditions? So these issues remain very challenging, but we're not going to get through them if we don't, create that table for engagement around them.
And so, thinking forward to this year, are you gonna be doing something substantially similar, or was that starting the conversation and now you're gonna go to something that's more like a compromise or a different tack?
Yeah, we'll be moving forward, I think, on some variations on the theme. I think we really did hear what are, some opportunities to fine tune in both those policies. They still will attract a lot of opposition, but for a long time in Washington State, and I think this is true in many states, we were sort of guided by this principle that state mandate bills on land use and zoning will just never garner the votes, won't get the support that they need. And we've seen, as the housing crisis has gotten worse, that there's more willingness among policymakers to think about the role that states can have in both land use, but also in regulation. So I think we'll come out with policies that acknowledge the conversations that we've had, make some modifications, but continue to push forward on pretty bold ideas that have not gained traction in a state like Washington before. But the key is going to be to bring together a big team. And so what I've been mostly focusing on with my colleagues in the House and Senate is really engaging in conversation about the diversity of housing policy that's required and kind of the team-based approach. Because, one or two bills, even if they're big idea bills, are not going to fully get at the scope of this challenge. So we're going to be coming forward again with local incentives for our cities, including tax incentives that benefit not only individual taxpayers, but can benefit local jurisdictions, looking again at our accessory dwelling unit policies to see if the state can set a standard for some consistency and some incentives to local communities, looking at where it's appropriate for the state to set, to preempt locals on zoning policy. And then, like many states, we are seeing incredible rent increases as we continue to navigate our way through the pandemic. And so we'll be looking at policies around how do we stabilize rents. My city, for instance, just passed pretty bold policy around tenant protections, requiring longer notice for rent increases, requiring relocation assistance for lower income tenants. And so looking at those kinds of approaches, I think, will be the sorts of tweaks we'll make.
Great, thank you. I want to go over to Senator Edwards. So last year you introduced SB 349. It had a ton of provisions, and it's one of my favorite pieces of legislation simply because I wrote a tweet storm about it that was picked up by the New York Times, and getting a tweet linked to the New York Times is, definitely been on my bucket list. But one of my favorite provisions in there was the requirement that all cities have to zone for all uses. And I think that would really help return zoning to its correct intent, which is coordinating uses rather than excluding them. But tell us more about 349 and what you think the biggest win in there would be.
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with such a distinguished panel to talk about something that, and to weigh in on something that's so important to our society today, particularly North Carolina. So when I became elected about 5 years ago, one of the top issues that folks kept coming to me with is the issue of affordable housing. And the more I got to watching what was taking place, the more I recognized that we had local governments continuing to say no to projects. We'd have a developer standing in City Hall ready to write a check to say, I want to put houses in that community, something that is very much needed. And local governments were finding a way to say no. In some cases, there's some good reasons to say no, but I saw little effort to help us get to yes. But instead, the only solution that I've seen put forth in the 5 years that I've served is that governments would tax citizens in some form or another to then go build places for people to live. And that just seems so counterintuitive to me that we're taxing the citizens to solve a problem that the free market wants to solve, but government was getting in the way. And so I introduced Senate Bill 349 that did a number of things. The thing that got the most attention that you're referring to, but because about 75% of the land in America that's zoned residential will not allow anything other than a single family home. And so this bill says if a municipality has water or sewer, and if a property is not in a historical district, and if it's not controlled by some other covenant, then it would be allowed to build a duplex, triplex, quadplex, townhome, or accessory dwelling unit. So that's the thing that I believe would, first of all, get the conversation started. Secondly, it would increase the housing supply, because we all know that the coefficient between supply and demand equals the price. And we realize affordability is measured by price. And so if there's anything that we want to materially do to make a difference, we've got to increase supply.
Thanks, that's great. Now, a couple of years ago in North Carolina, I don't know if you were involved with this personally, but the body that you sit in passed a good bill which just kind of quietly banned minimum home sizes. And as far as I know, not a single news source picked up on it. I learned about it because I work at an organization that has a really good team of state outreach people who read legislation that gets passed, and nobody else does apparently. And so that's the kind of thing that was, in my mind, one of those small bore, but so it's not a huge effect. Most places don't have minimum home sizes, but it was obviously not controversial to pass. And I don't know if you were involved with that at all, but if so, do you have any insights that came from that experience?
Well, yes, I was involved, not as heavily as I am with this bill. We've been able to find a number of regulatory issues in North Carolina that we've been able to change in small ways, such as this one that allows the free market to decide what needs to be built and what consumers want. That was a significant piece of legislation. Yes.
Tremendous. All right, Senator Chang, thank you for your patience. So you've proposed, we had a great email exchange, but you've proposed a Singapore-style high-rise program called Aloha Homes for Hawaii. And aside from having the best acronym, what is this policy and why would it be a big win?
Well, thanks, Salim. And again, thank you to the organizers for having me today to join two really fantastic guests from whom I've already learned a lot so far. So when I became the housing chair in the Hawaii State Senate a few years ago, one of the principles that I wanted to follow is a famous quote from the Constitutional Convention. We must let experience be our only guide because reason may mislead us. And so Hawaii has had a very severe housing shortage for many years, decades, generations. And I wanted to take a look at jurisdictions that actually had solved housing shortages in the real world. And two of the most prominent are Vienna and Singapore, and they're both public housing models. In other words, the government constructs the housing for people to live in. And they have a lot of interesting features, but just a handful were really the most critical, in my opinion. Number one, they actually built enough to meet demand. Unlike current policies under LIHTC or Section 8, where only a small fraction of those who are eligible actually receive housing, Singapore, 82% of the population lives in government housing. In Vienna, it's over 60%. Another really important aspect that they have that America has never tried is they have either no or very high income restrictions. So in America, every public housing unit has an income restriction on it, which makes intuitive sense because we want people who need the housing most to get it the first. But not so in Singapore and Vienna. They have, in Singapore in particular, they have an initial very high housing requirement, income requirement if you move in initially. But on the secondary market, if you sell your unit, there's no income restriction at all. So you have millionaires living side by side with formerly homeless folks. And these two aspects I thought were really critical. I would just add a third, which I think is really important, which is the urban planning, a super dense, narrow streets and sidewalks, ground floor retail type of really walkable, car-free type of housing. And all of this would be to solve Hawaii's housing shortage using as little land as possible, because paving over the beautiful, special, undeveloped conservation and agricultural lands of Hawaii is extremely controversial. And so we've proposed this Aloha Homes Bill, affordable, locally owned homes for all, to do just that, to construct very high density housing on state-owned lands near rail stations, to make them available to all, regardless of income, without also a taxpayer subsidy. And so we've been proposing the bill for the last 4 years now. It's gotten as far as the end of the legislative session. It hasn't passed yet, but we're hopeful that some variation of this measure will be able to make it across the finish line in the near future.
Thanks. So I think there's actually really interesting. I mean, there's obviously there's a lot of differences that we've heard across these three approaches that each of you has taken. And aside from the obvious sort of partisan and market versus government differences between the two senators we've spoken to, where another difference here is Senator Edwards' bill did a lot of different things, which might get compromised, down in committee, et cetera. And Senator Chang's does one big thing, right? So we've got sort of a hedgehog and fox approach here. And Senator Chang, how do you think about that? Like, do you think that it's for us, it's more important, and maybe setting aside the merits of your own ideas. Is it more important to find one kind of really big thing that works, or are we more likely to get further by, kind of chipping away at 17 different margins of the same problem?
Well, that goes back to our initial question. How have actual jurisdictions in the real world ended housing shortages? And there are some that do it by, loosening restrictions, and there are some that do it by large, public sector interventions. Houston is a well-known example of a jurisdiction that doesn't have zoning, right? So you can demolish your house and you can build an office building or an oil refinery. And although Houston has been one of the nation's fastest growing cities for decades, it has below national median home prices. So it is possible to deregulate your way to housing. The reason I chose the large public sector intervention with a really high density model is because, unlike Houston, Hawaii is an archipelago of small islands. We really treasure our open space, our undeveloped land, and the idea that we might just grow like a huge blob like Houston is not a politically viable idea in Hawaii. So to me, it was really a question of political viability, which of the models that we should be going for.
Great, thank you. So I just want to say to all our guests and audience today, please do put questions in the chat. I'm not necessarily going to use all of those, but I'll pull some of those out of the chat and ask the panelists. Let's go back to Representative Macri. Remember from Oregon's experience with the approach that you've pursued. One of the things they were able to do is get bipartisan support, at least for the upzoning portion of that sort of that scissors. How have you thought about sort of the necessity? Obviously it's a blue state that you're in. Do you need Republican votes? Do you want them? Like, what's the math that you're thinking about as you're sort of crafting ideas, and at what point do you kind of bring in the other party?
Yeah, thanks for that, Salim. I think it is important to be engaging with my Republican colleagues, and what I have found is that these policies, often don't fall on party lines. So particularly on the land use issues, it has been important to build a bipartisan team on some of them. So it's what we need to do is try to find that point where we can get the right mix of members from both parties to support policy. I think there is, obviously shared concern about the housing needs of our constituents across the state. Where I think the parties sometimes differ is in the solutions we propose to address that, where often Republicans will be proposing more market-based deregulation type strategies, and Democrats will look more to regulatory approaches. And so where there can be common ground, I think it's really important for us to work towards that common ground. And we have some good experience in Washington State in recent years in doing that. The link in the chat that Gabriella posted about a bill that we worked on in 2019 that really looked to incentivize local communities to build more diverse housing is one where we brought a broad stakeholder group together. So we had, builders of housing, developers, realtors, tenant activists, local jurisdictions, our construction industry, all of these representatives at the table in an attempt to find that sweet spot where we could get broad support. And we did, and we were able to pass that with broad bipartisan support. We have similarly worked on accessory dwelling unit policy on a really bipartisan basis. And so I do think there is opportunity. Obviously the tenant protection work, and particularly anytime you're talking about regulating rents, that it tends to be a pretty partisan issue. But on the zoning for sure, I think it's really important to engage with our Republican colleagues. And I'll say, while we have Democratic majorities in the House and Senate and the governor's office in Washington State, it's not that we consider ourselves to be a relatively purple state, and it's not that long ago where we did have Republican majorities in the Senate, and so we look to that history of trying to find points of bipartisan agreement.
Tremendous. Senator Edwards, so SB 349 was introduced by bipartisan group of 3 or 4 legislators, correct?
Yeah, it was.
And maybe say a few words about that, but then I actually have another question. I want to go back to the sort of the duplex, triplex type zoning. But were there any things that were kind of non-negotiables as you kind of brought the two parties together before writing the bill, or was it were the things that you were looking at coming in all pretty agreeable on both sides?
Well, as we were writing the bill, the elements that you've seen in it were agreed upon by the co-sponsors and a number of other legislators. The argument, or the controversy really came as we started sharing it with other folks out there. In fact, I had a number of folks look at me and go, "What in the world are you thinking? A Republican would never draft a bill like this." To which I feel that I've got some pretty strong responses.
That's great. That's great. And if you all saw my mouth moving, I was telling my children that I couldn't help them right now. This is the value of having the desk face the wall and not the door. Right, so getting back to the meat of the bill. So both yours and Representative Macri's bills, and then several others that we've seen in other states, focus on upzoning and allowing 2-family houses throughout single-family zones. I totally support that. I would be happy to have that in my neighborhood, and happy to vote for it if I were in a position to do so. But I wonder, so you've obviously had conversations with North Carolina builders. Is that a form that they feel like they can make that viable in a lot of places? Because I think my biggest question is on the it's obviously a big political lift. Like, you're affecting a lot of neighborhoods, and so you can get more blowback than if you have a more, say, focused approach, right? Like Senator Chang's, you could pick one location and say, okay, all of the backyard is going to be here, and it's not going to be in your backyard. But if we do this sort of everywhere, if we win, can the builders really take advantage of that? And are they going to build duplexes or triplexes at scale? And I'm curious if you've heard from that community how they feel about that kind of law.
Yeah, well, the answer to your question in a very short manner is yes. The builders are wildly excited about this bill, and I've had them tell me for the last 5 years, we want to help solve this problem. We're ready. The issue really becomes the restrictions, and I believe that when I work the math out at who could afford a home that can't now, we could probably add about 1 million more people in North Carolina that could afford a home when we build to scale.
That's amazing. Senator Chang, so you've got, as we mentioned, one really big ambitious idea. What are some of the things that are kind of moving in Hawaii, or that maybe haven't moved in Hawaii, that are below the radar but worthwhile?
Well, that's an interesting question. The national trend seems to be this upzoning trend, as we've heard from both of our guests today. you know, I've actually tried to move bills like that in Hawaii, and one got pretty far in the hearing process this past year. One of the problems we faced in Hawaii is, the eternal issue of whether you call it, neighborhood place attachment or neighborhood defender or NIMBYism, not in my backyard. It's really powerful. And, the example that I always give is, when I was running for so I served on the city council. So I've sat through many hearings where thousands of passionate, angry, crying people tried to persuade the city council to not upzone this or to not allow a tower to be built there. And but the example that I always give is there was a home in my district that was owned by an order of Catholic nuns, the Sisters of St. Joseph, as a home for the retired nuns. And they went before the community association because they wanted to renovate. And among the things they wanted to do in the renovation is to install an elevator because these elderly nuns were having a hard time going up and down the stairs. And sure enough, the community association came out and opposed that. So, sort of coloring all of my perception of all of this is, if we were truly to allow, upzoning in communities like that one, like Ainahaina, like Ka'ava, like Mililani, like Nanakuli, like Wailai like Kailua, it would, to allow what in Hawaii are known as monster homes to spring up in every single neighborhood. I just it is hard for me to imagine that the people, the voters of Hawaii, would prefer that solution to just a really targeted, okay, this one parcel, this 100-acre parcel gets built with 200 towers, but every other existing neighborhood remains exactly the same, fossilized in amber forever. And so that's that's our experience in Hawaii. In fact, some of the traditionally pro-construction, pro-growth stakeholders are against the so-called monster homes in Hawaii too. And in the meantime, we've introduced over 60 bills in the last session alone that have to do with housing. They do with matters large and small, whether it's upzoning, whether it's like Singapore does, a opt-out savings account, so that everyone is able to save for their homes kind of in the background without them really thinking about it. We have bills to allow communities, individual blocks, to allow a third story or a second story on top of their homes. But I guess one of the reasons why I focused on like you were saying, the hedgehog and the fox approach is because I have yet to see, I've been pushing a silver bullet because I've yet to see silver buckshot work anywhere. I silver bullets have worked in Singapore, in Vienna, and so on, with a big idea that kind of mobilizes people behind it. But lots of little things. I just don't see. I'll give you another example. The city and county of Honolulu massively cracked down on Airbnbs and other short-term vacation rentals in 2019 before the pandemic. And that was one of the main culprits, scapegoats that people blamed for the lack of affordable housing in Hawaii. And sure enough, the statistics reveal that the short-term vacation rentals have plummeted by 42% in that 2-year period, that demand has plummeted 48% in that 2-year period. And I have not received a single thank you note saying, thank you for cracking down on the Airbnbs because that has brought affordable housing to everybody. In fact, the cost of housing has not stabilized or not gone down, it's gone up, and it's shattered, records in all 4 counties of Hawaii since that bill was passed. So I guess, even though that might have been a pretty drastic measure, it wasn't drastic enough to move the needle. And that's why I keep wanting to, focus on big, drastic issues that actually do have a chance of solving the problem and actually moving the needle.
Thank you. So I think another interesting contrast between Hawaii and North Carolina is the jurisdictional diversity, right? So Hawaii's housing crisis is really concentrated in a single city-county jurisdiction in the capital. But in North Carolina, it's everywhere, right? And the cities are growing and changing. North Carolina has really generous annexation laws that allow cities to annex land as they grow in a very kind of buckshot manner. So Senator Edwards, in your context, how much do you feel like the different parts of the state are kind of in the same boat and facing the same challenges, and how much do they really need unique solutions, or they're just like, wow, Hickory just isn't dealing with a housing crisis, we're dealing with an outmigration crisis?
Yeah, well, I certainly believe that the problem is statewide in the large metropolitan areas and the small metropolitan areas in our rural areas. The solutions may be a bit different from region to region, but the problem is definitely prevalent. It's becoming more and more of a problem in the bigger metropolitan areas. In fact, since introducing this bill, we've had 2 major metropolitan areas come out and pass local legislation that would accomplish essentially the same thing in relaxing development standards in single family only residential areas.
And Representative Macri, how about Washington State, right? Obviously, maybe kind of in between the other two in terms of having one very big metro area and then a lot of quite rural areas. How much of it is there a housing crisis outside of, Seattle, Bellingham?
Yeah, it's quite significant statewide, and I think it's important to look at some of the drivers, right, of the local economies and what's causing it. But generally, it's what is true nationally is true in Washington, that we have undersupply relative to demand in all areas of the state. In fact, I was elected in 2016, and I ran on these issues as we were having an intensifying housing crisis in the Seattle area. But now, although rents and housing costs remain the highest in the Seattle area, they're actually growing at faster rates in other parts of the state. Spokane is leading the nation and increases in both home purchase prices and in rents right now. And so when I talk with legislators from other states, it's not just the metro areas, particularly in Western states, that sort of led on the forefront of this housing crisis, but it is in every single state, which is why I believe we're now seeing more national attention on these issues. So I think, yes, I think that's why we have been building momentum, and we have definitely been growing the team on housing policy, because more and more legislators are hearing from their constituents that you've got to do something different because it's getting bad. In my city, we have a race for mayor going on right now, and issues around housing affordability and homelessness, are by far the top issues being discussed. And we're seeing more and more, I think, a willingness at the local level to talk about zoning reform. But not only that, we're also hearing about protections for historic BIPOC communities who are being displaced. How do we build and retain home ownership among BIPOC households? How do we protect renters? What investments should government make? How should we raise the revenues to do that? What are the most strategic places we can put our dollars? So I think we're just seeing more and more of those conversations, not only in the big city here in Seattle, the largest city in Washington State, but also in a lot of the small towns.
Great. We've got a question in the chat from Jake Krimmel, who's a really good economist and student of urban growth. He asks, and any of you can jump in here. You don't all three need to, but if you've got a good answer, what metrics do you use to judge the severity and nature of your housing crisis? Like rents, prices, the price level, the price growth. Do you measure it relative to income, or is that not so important? Location, distance to the city center, et cetera. And I'll also say, while you think about that answer, I very much would welcome questions from panelists to each other, right? If you're thinking about hey, we had that idea, but it got shot down. How did you make it work, or whatever. I'd love to hear crosstalk among you guys.
Well, I'll just jump in on this housing crisis. How do you measure it? And that's actually a topic that I've kind of gotten into disagreements with the economists here in Hawaii who measure our housing crisis, and they measure housing demand based on population growth. And actually now, because of the housing shortage in Hawaii, population has fallen for 4 straight years statewide, the first time that that's happened ever in Hawaii's history. And so to me, to be wonky and nerdy for a second, population growth is not an independent variable. It's a dependent variable that depends on the housing supply. So when you're measuring demand based on population, you're actually measuring, you're measuring something that's being caused by something else, which is the lack of population. If it were up to me, I have a friend who says, well, Hawaii should have the number of housing units per population that the whole country has. Which would be huge, which would be a huge expansion. My proposal is the median home price in Hawaii should be affordable to the median household in Hawaii. So right now, the median home price in Honolulu is over $1 million. And so if the median household is making about $55,000, then you would sort of backwards calculate using the federal 30% income standard on housing, and you would get something closer to a, I don't know, $300,000 or $400,000 mark. That's how we would know the housing shortage is over. But to be less nerdy and wonky for a moment, when I talk to normal people who aren't housing experts and economists, what I say was, my father was an immigrant from China. He had one state job. He was a professor at the University of Hawaii. He was able to buy a house to put my brother and me through private school. I went to private college and private graduate school as well. He was able to buy investment property and then retire comfortably on one state government salary. For me, as a person with one state salary today, to buy that same house that he bought in 1983 would take over 30 years of my entire income. So the idea that one job should be enough, that it is able to sustain a family, that somewhere along the line over those past decades, that idea has completely disappeared off the rate. I mean, it is utterly incomprehensible that I, with my one state salary, would be able to do even a small fraction of what he was able to do. And that to me is the housing shortage. And that's why I would propose offering an unlimited number of homes at $300,000 or $400,000 to people, to everyone who wants one, so that there's no longer a constraint on housing. No longer are we, subject to these constraints of price.
Yeah, I feel like your economists telling you to use population as your measure of demand are not very good economists. And I've looked at the list of participants. We can be wonky. Don't have no fear. So Henry Kramer has a question for Senator Edwards primarily. What arguments have you found most and least persuasive for Republican colleagues when building consensus?
My arguments to those folks that say this is not a Republican solution is, first of all, to take a look back at one of the most famous Republicans of all time, and that's Ronald Reagan. In 1982, he commissioned a study on housing, and one of the recommendations was exactly what I proposed in Senate Bill 349. And so there's certainly a precedent there from Republican leadership. I think that this bill respects the free market rather than government trying to decide what needs to be built. We just relax regulations and let the free market decide what folks need, what they want, what they'll buy, and builders and real estate agents will make it happen. I believe this bill rejects the current socialist approach. Instead of taxing citizens and building places for them to live, which we just frankly can't do enough of. It reduces regulation. This bill increases the right of the property owners. One of the biggest arguments that I get is that this bill takes away local control, to which I say, okay, guilty. It is that local control that has helped get us to the point that we are right now that's restricted development. And the General Assembly is well within our rights to release a bit more local control. And that really begs the argument also, who should have local control? Should it be government or should it be the property owner? Those are the arguments that I found most useful when folks tell me that this is not a Republican solution.
And what arguments don't work for Republicans that you might, obviously not ones that are obviously not Republican arguments, but what are some things that me as a right of center economist might be tempted to make and would actually backfire?
That's an interesting question, because the directions from which I've received controversy on this bill are somewhat surprising. The folks that don't like the bill are anybody that is a part of a local government. If they work for a local government, or it's a city council or a mayor or county commission, they don't like the bill. If someone lives in a municipality where this could affect the property next to them, then they're against this bill. And I tell folks that really it's time for a gut check. Do we want to solve this problem, or do we want to just continue to bury our heads in the sand and think that it's going to go away? We can't solve it by continuing to tax citizens. There has to be some free market approach towards fixing the problem.
That's great. I'll share one Republican idea that I really love, which Charlie Baker championed in Massachusetts, and his Democratic legislature wrote the bill and gave it to him. He signed. So Massachusetts has long had a restriction that you can only change zoning with a 2/3 vote of the local body. And he basically made it so that for most upzonings, you can now do it with 50%. So there's a presumption of liberty built into that, right? So to add restrictions, 2/3. To remove restrictions, 50%. I really like that. I'd love to see states that have a similar structure do something like that. There's still local control. It's still the locals voting, but we're putting a bias in favor of property rights the same way that our justice system has a bias in favor of innocence.
I like that.
All right, so here's a question from Alex Horowitz. Researchers have estimated that loosening zoning regulations would boost economic growth and reduce homelessness and the need for subsidies. Has that figured into your legislative debates, tying housing bills to economic growth and the state budget? And I'd say this is actually true for transportation budgets as well. If you allow transit-oriented development, you'll find that your transit's a lot more likely to pay for itself, with at the fare box than if you've got low density oriented transit stations.
Yeah, are you directing the question to me?
Sorry, to any of the panelists. Representative Macri, you looked like you were ready to answer that.
Yeah, we've had some discussion about that for sure. And I want to also say, like, part of my reason for working on zoning policy, which has become more popular with progressives in recent years, but typically there has been a lot of focus on just the kinds of ideas that Senator Edwards is saying that he doesn't support. Like, let us focus on folks who have failed to gain access to the market for generations, and make sure the government is taking care of the most vulnerable. Well, it's clear that is not a workable solution on its own. That we have broader dysfunction in the housing markets, that you can no longer really be successful in looking at this narrow band of government intervening only for the extremely low income, for the people who are homeless, et cetera. So I have in some ways positioned myself as an unlikely voice on loosening restrictions for private market development, in part to bring some of my constituencies to the table on this. And I still have lots of folks who are, fighting for renters' rights, who are fighting for progressive taxation to invest in, publicly financed housing for the lowest income people, saying, why are you bothering with this zoning policy? And it's for the reasons that Alex puts in the comment. It's the reasons that over 90% of us are going to live in private market housing. We cannot ignore the fact that the private market has to be a major contributor to solving this challenge, that I feel like it's important. I mean, our communities are struggling. I mean, Senator Chang gave a couple of good examples. I represent one of the highest cost districts in the state of Washington. We have thousands of folks, even during the pandemic, post-pandemic, who work in our district who can't afford to live anywhere close to where they work. They are driving. We don't have adequate transit infrastructure for folks. And while we can continue to build out that transit infrastructure, what we need to simultaneously focus on is the fact that people should be able to live close to where they work, close to where they go to school. And there's an important role, I think, for state lawmakers to play in that conversation. If we leave this to be a locals only conversation, well, we see where we've gotten with that. And the fact is that just local elected officials have different kinds of pressures on them from their constituents, our shared constituents, than state policymakers do. And so economic growth is important. And I'm having more and more conversations with my constituents who are starting to see that the challenges that cause people not to afford housing and become homeless in our district are now the same pressures that are causing them to move further and further away from the kinds of lifestyles that they want, further and further away from their jobs, from their social networks, et cetera. And so we have to see these issues we have to see this as one issue and all the pieces of it sort of interconnected.
Great. One of the things on sort of the same question related to economic growth, a policy that I'm really emphasizing this year is really tied into the recovery from the pandemic and the decline in office usage, right? So a lot of us, like me, are working from home. And there's going to be this slow-moving migration out of offices. It won't be everyone, but it's going to be real. And a lot of places already have 20% plus office vacancy rates. And rezoning, whether this is the city or the state, rezoning commercial land for residential, to me is one of the biggest potential wins, because those are sites that are already served by utilities, right? So you're not talking about a big public sector layout or new kind of long-term liabilities. And they're usually not right in someone's backyard. They're not ideal, right? They're not going to be Norman Rockwell, kind of town center locations in most cases, but I think there's a possibility, and really tying that when we talk to local officials, tying that to recovering, getting it, you've got a non-performing property that's not going to be paying its local taxes. Restoring that to something useful is really going to help everyone. All right, we've just got a couple more minutes. Panelists, any questions for each other? Any last any things that I haven't asked you about, or bills that you or your colleagues have introduced this year that we haven't talked about that you're really excited about I'm going to just get these final thoughts out here in our last 3 minutes.
I do want to say that I think it's really important for us to think about what local communities need to do this well. There is resistance that I don't want to minimize that or sugarcoat it, and the passionate voices that come out, now virtually to City Hall to express concern about changes to the status quo. Those concerns are significant, but some of the resistance from cities is that they just don't have the capacity to implement significant changes, be it to zoning or permitting, et cetera, and they need state support to do that. Essentially, they need dollars for planning and for implementation. And so that just has to be a part of our consideration. Just passing down unfunded mandates has been another challenge in how we approach the policy. So, and I think that's become more clear as we've implemented more pro-housing policy in Washington State. We have that feedback loop where we're hearing from cities about how the state can partner with them to help meet their needs.
Really important. Thank you. Senators, last thoughts? All right. Well, then I'll thank the speakers. Really great conversation. Let's continue this, in our own networks, mostly private. But let's keep thinking about what are the big wins, what are the juices that are worth the squeeze, and make these changes happen from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Appreciate all of your time in the audience and the great questions. Have a great day.